The desert heat pressed down on the sprawling military training ground like a physical weight. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, and the air shimmered above the sun-baked concrete of the main parade ground. Gathered in perfect formation stood 1,040 soldiers, their uniforms crisp, their faces a mix of exhaustion and discipline. They had been standing at attention for nearly an hour, waiting for the final demonstration of a week-long joint training exercise between conventional Army units and Special Operations Forces. Among the visiting instructors was a man who needed no introduction, a Navy SEAL, decorated, hardened, and known for a tongue as sharp as his combat skills. His name is withheld for privacy, but his reputation had arrived days before he did. The soldiers had heard the whispers. This man had survived ambushes, completed missions that sounded like fiction, and reportedly once knocked out a fellow operator during a sparring match for looking at him wrong. He was the kind of legend who fed on his own myth. The SEAL stood apart from the formation, arms crossed, legs shoulder-width apart, his dark sunglasses hiding whatever judgment brewed in his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the coiled stillness of a predator. Beside him stood the base commander, a colonel who had seen combat in 3 theaters, yet even he seemed to shrink slightly in the SEAL's presence. The exercise was supposed to be a demonstration of hand-to-hand combat techniques, controlled, professional, educational. But from the moment the SEAL opened his mouth, it became something else entirely. "Listen up," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I've been doing this longer than most of you have been alive. I've killed men with my bare hands. I've broken bones without breaking a sweat. And in about 10 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why the Navy doesn't waste time training people who can't fight." He paced slowly in front of the first row of soldiers, his boots thudding rhythmically against the ground. "If any of you think you're tough, think again. You're not soldiers. You're children playing dress-up." The 1,040 soldiers stood frozen. Not a single one moved. Not a single one blinked. Insults during training were common, even expected. But this felt different. This felt personal. The SEAL wasn't just pushing them to be better, he was tearing them down for the sake of his own ego. The colonel shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The SEAL was a guest, after all, and an honored one at that. No one wanted to cause an incident. Then the SEAL stopped in front of a young woman in the 3rd row. She was a sergeant, 26 years old, with close-cropped dark hair and a face that had seen its share of hardship. Her name was Sergeant Mina Alvarez, and she had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Texas, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs. Mina had joined the Army to escape a cycle of violence at home, to prove that she was more than her circumstances. She had excelled in basic training, scored top marks in hand-to-hand combat, and earned a reputation among her peers as someone who never backed down, never complained, and never quit. But she was also quiet, humble, and deeply uncomfortable with attention. The SEAL leaned down, bringing his face close to hers. "You," he said. "What's your name, soldier?" "Sergeant Alvarez, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "Alvarez," he repeated, drawing out the syllables as if tasting something sour. "Let me guess. You're here because you wanted to prove something. Because Daddy didn't love you enough. Because you think wearing a uniform makes you special." He straightened up and looked at the rest of the formation. "This is what the Army has become. Soft, emotional, women playing soldier while real men do the fighting." A ripple of unease went through the ranks. Some soldiers shifted their weight. Others clenched their jaws. But Mina did not move. Her eyes remained fixed straight ahead, her breathing calm. She had been insulted before. She had been underestimated before. She had learned, long ago, that the best response to cruelty was not anger, but patience. The SEAL, perhaps sensing that he hadn't gotten a reaction, decided to push harder. "You know what, Alvarez? I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to give you a chance to prove me wrong." He turned to the colonel and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I want to do a live demonstration, unscripted, full contact. Me versus her. Right here, right now." The colonel hesitated. "Sir, that's not exactly. Are you questioning me?" The SEAL interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The colonel looked at Mina. He knew her record. He knew she was capable. But he also knew that the SEAL was a killer, a man trained to neutralize threats with brutal efficiency. A demonstration like this could end badly. Very badly. Yet refusing would cause a different kind of problem. The SEAL's ego was already on full display. Denying him would only make things worse. "Sergeant Alvarez," the colonel said finally. "Do you consent?" Mina turned her head slightly to look at the colonel. Her expression was unreadable. Then she looked back at the SEAL, who was smirking now, already savoring his victory. "I consent, sir," she said. The formation broke into a wider circle, the soldiers stepping back to create a makeshift arena. The SEAL removed his sunglasses and handed them to an aide. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, and bounced lightly on the balls of his feet. He looked like a lion toying with a gazelle. "Just remember," he announced, loud enough for all 1,040 soldiers to hear, "I'm a Navy SEAL. What happens next is on you." Mina removed her helmet and placed it on the ground. She unstrapped her body armor and set it aside. She wanted no protection, no excuses. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were lean but corded with muscle, not showy gym muscle, but the dense, functional strength of someone who had spent years doing push-ups in the rain and carrying wounded comrades on her back. The SEAL came at her immediately. No touch of gloves, no formal start. He threw a heavy punch aimed at her face, a strike meant to end the fight before it began. But Mina had been watching him all morning. She had noticed the way he favored his right side, the slight limp in his left leg from an old injury, the way he telegraphed his punches by dropping his shoulder a split second before throwing. She ducked under the punch, pivoted on her left foot, and drove her right fist into his exposed ribs not once, but twice, with the speed of a striking snake. The SEAL grunted in surprise. He hadn't expected her to counter. He hadn't expected her to be fast. He recovered quickly and swung again, this time a wide hook that would have taken her head off if it had landed. Mina stepped inside the arc of the punch, too close for him to generate power, and slammed her forehead into his nose. There was a wet crack, and blood sprayed across both of them. The crowd of 1,040 soldiers gasped. No one had ever seen a Navy SEAL bleed in a training exercise. The SEAL staggered backward, momentarily stunned. His nose was broken. Blood poured down his face and into his mouth. For the first time, the arrogance in his eyes was replaced by something else: confusion, maybe even fear. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, stared at the blood, and then roared in anger. He charged at Mina like a bull, abandoning all technique, all discipline. He wanted to grab her, to use his weight and strength to crush her against the ground, but Mina had been waiting for exactly that. She sidestepped at the last possible moment, stuck out her left leg, and watched as the SEAL stumbled past her, off balance and vulnerable. In that instant, she turned, planted her feet, and threw a single, perfectly aimed punch to the side of his jaw. It was not a wild swing. It was not a lucky shot. It was a strike she had practiced 10,000 times in the dark, alone, in the gym, when no one was watching. A strike born of discipline, not anger. The SEAL's eyes went wide. Then they rolled back. His body went limp, and he collapsed face first onto the concrete with a sickening thud. He did not move. He did not twitch. He was completely unconscious. The silence that followed was absolute. 1,040 soldiers stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A Navy SEAL, one of the most feared warriors on the planet, had been knocked out cold by a young Army sergeant half his size. And she had done it in front of everyone. She had done it cleanly, quickly, and without a single wasted motion. For a long moment, Mina stood over him, breathing steadily. Her knuckles were bleeding. Her heart was pounding. But her face showed no triumph, no gloating. She simply looked down at the unconscious man, and then up at the colonel, as if asking permission to return to formation. The colonel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Neither did any of the 1,040 soldiers. They were too shocked, too awed, too deeply moved by what they had just seen. Somewhere in the back of the formation, a young private began to cry, not from sadness, but from something closer to relief. Because in that moment, every single person in that formation understood the same truth, that strength is not about titles or reputation or the color of your patch. Strength is about what you do when someone tells you that you cannot. The medics arrived within seconds, rushing to the SEAL's side. They rolled him onto his back, checked his pulse, shined a light into his eyes. He was breathing, but deeply unconscious, his jaw already beginning to swell into a grotesque shape. The medics placed a cervical collar around his neck and loaded him onto a stretcher, moving with the efficient urgency of people who had done this 100 times before. As they carried him away, the SEAL's blood left a dark trail on the concrete, a stark reminder that even legends could fall, But the story did not end with the SEAL being carried off the field. In many ways, that was only the beginning. Because the aftermath of that single punch would prove to be far more complicated, far more emotional, and far more revealing than the fight itself. Mina stood exactly where she had landed the blow. She had not moved. Her hands were still raised slightly, not in a fighting stance, but in the reflexive posture of someone who had just been in a life-or-death situation and was still processing that it was over. Her chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths. She looked at her bleeding knuckles, then at the spot where the SEAL had fallen. A single tear escaped from the corner of her right eye and traced a slow path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, as if ashamed of showing vulnerability in front of her peers. The colonel finally found his voice. "Sergeant Alvarez," he said quietly, "come with me." He led her away from the formation, past rows of wide-eyed soldiers, toward a small administrative building at the edge of the parade ground. Neither of them spoke during the walk. The colonel's mind was racing through the potential consequences: a formal complaint from the SEAL's command, a possible investigation, maybe even a court-martial if the SEAL decided to press charges for excessive force. He knew Mina was not at fault. The SEAL had asked for the demonstration, had thrown the first punch, had been warned, but the military was not always a place where justice moved quickly or fairly. Reputation mattered. Politics mattered. And the SEAL had friends in very high places. Inside the colonel's office, Mina sat in a wooden chair, her hands resting on her thighs. The colonel closed the door and leaned against his desk, studying her for a long moment. "Talk to me," he said. "What happened out there?" Mina looked at him, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "He asked for it, sir. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to prove that women don't belong in combat." She paused, swallowing hard. "But that's not why I hit him that hard. I hit him that hard because I couldn't afford not to." The colonel waited. "My mother raised me alone," Mina continued, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floor. "She worked as a housekeeper for rich families who treated her like furniture. I watched her come home every night with bruised hands and a broken spirit. And when I was 15, one of her employers, a man with a title and a big house, pinned her against a wall and tried to, you know." Mina's jaw tightened. She fought him off. But no one believed her, because he was important and she was nobody. "That's when I learned that the world doesn't protect you. You have to protect yourself." The colonel said nothing. He had heard similar stories before, from soldiers of every rank and background. But there was something different about the way Mina told hers, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with a heavy, weary acceptance that was somehow more devastating than either. "When that SEAL looked at me and said I was playing soldier," Mina went on, "I saw every man who ever looked down on my mother. I saw every recruiter who tried to talk me out of enlisting. I saw every drill sergeant who told me I wasn't strong enough. And I realized that if I let him win, if I held back, if I pulled my punch, if I gave him even an inch, then I would be proving him right. Not just for me. For every woman who will ever put on this uniform after me." The colonel nodded slowly. He was a man of few words, but his eyes told Mina that he understood. He walked around his desk, picked up his phone, and made a single call. He did not identify himself by name. He simply said, "We have a situation. And it's not what you think." Meanwhile, back on the parade ground, the 1,040 soldiers had not been dismissed. They stood in formation, but the silence had been replaced by a low murmur of conversation. People were processing what they had seen in their own ways. Some were laughing not at the SEAL, but at the sheer absurdity of it all. A Navy SEAL, knocked out by a sergeant. It sounded like a joke, except it had happened 20 feet in front of them. Others were angry, feeling that the SEAL had disrespected not just Mina, but the entire unit. And still others were quietly, privately emotional, wiping their eyes when they thought no one was looking. A young private named Thompson, who had been standing next to Mina in the formation, turned to the soldier beside him. "Did you see her face?" he asked after he went down. "She wasn't happy. She looked sad." The soldier beside him shook his head. "That's not sadness, man. That's exhaustion. She just carried every single one of us on her back." Word spread quickly through the base, then beyond. Within hours, the story had reached other units, other bases, even other branches of the military. Phones buzzed with texts and photos and shaky video clips taken by soldiers who had discreetly recorded the demonstration. Social media lit up with debates. Was Mina a hero or a liability? Had she used excessive force, or had she simply defended herself? The SEAL's supporters argued that he had been caught off guard, that he wasn't trying his best, that any real fight would have ended differently. Mina's supporters pointed to the footage, clear, undeniable, frame by frame, that showed a trained warrior being defeated by a more disciplined, more focused opponent, but the person at the center of the storm remained in the colonel's office, waiting. She did not check her phone. She did not call her mother. She simply sat in the wooden chair, staring at the crack in the floor, and thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment. She thought about the night she had told her mother she was joining the army. Her mother had cried, begged her not to go, said she had not raised her daughter to be a soldier. Mina had held her mother's hands, those same bruised, tired hands, and said, "I'm doing this so no one ever hurts you again." 3 hours later, the SEAL woke up in the base hospital with a broken jaw, a fractured ego, and a head full of confusion. The first thing he saw was his commanding officer, who had flown in from a nearby Special Operations Command. The second thing he saw was a formal complaint form, already filled out, accusing him of conduct unbecoming and initiating an unauthorized use of force. The SEAL tried to speak, but his jaw was wired shut. All he could do was listen as his commanding officer read him the charges that had been filed not by Mina, not by the colonel, but by the SEAL's own team members, who had watched the video and decided that their brother had gone too far. The SEAL closed his eyes. For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. 3 weeks passed before Mina saw the SEAL again. In that time, the military conducted a full investigation into the incident, interviewing dozens of witnesses, reviewing multiple video angles, and even bringing in a use-of-force expert to analyze the punch that had ended the fight. The conclusion was unanimous. Sergeant Mina Alvarez had acted in self-defense, had used reasonable force given the circumstances, and had demonstrated exceptional restraint by not continuing to strike the SEAL after he lost consciousness. The SEAL, on the other hand, was formally reprimanded for conduct unbecoming, ordered to undergo anger management training, and quietly reassigned to a non-operational role. His career as a frontline operator was over, but the investigation was not what mattered to Mina. What mattered was the letter she received on a Thursday morning, delivered by hand to her barracks room. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for her name and rank. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, as if the person writing it had struggled to hold the pen. The letter read, "Sergeant Alvarez, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to accept this. But I owe you an apology, and I'm not going to hide behind my rank or my reputation or my ego anymore. You beat me, fair and square. You didn't just knock me out. You showed me something I had forgotten, that being a warrior is not about intimidating people. It's about serving them. I looked at you and saw a weakness, but the weakness was mine. I had become the very thing I swore to destroy, a bully. Thank you for reminding me what humility looks like. I will carry this lesson for the rest of my life." A former Selmina read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and went to mourning formation as if nothing had happened. She did not show the letter to anyone. She did not brag about it. She simply tucked it away, next to her heart, and continued her day. But the letter was not the only thing that happened in those 3 weeks. Something else was growing, something far more powerful than a single punch or a single apology. The 1,040 soldiers who had witnessed the fight had not forgotten. They had not moved on. Instead, they had been changed in ways that would reveal themselves slowly, over time, in moments both small and profound. A week after the incident, a young male soldier named Private First Class Marcus Webb walked into the chaplain's office and, for the first time in his life, admitted that he was struggling with depression. He had been taught that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that soldiers were supposed to suffer in silence. But watching Mina woman half his size stand up to a Navy SEAL without fear had cracked something open inside him. If she could be that brave, he reasoned, then maybe he could be brave enough to ask for help. The chaplain listened, made some calls, and got Marcus into counseling. 6 months later, Marcus would write Mina a letter thanking her for saving his life. She never responded. But she kept that letter too, 2 weeks after the incident. A female sergeant named Denise Okonkwo, who had been considering leaving the military after years of casual sexism and dismissed promotions walked into her commanding officer's office and demanded to be considered for the next leadership course. When the officer hesitated, Denise said, "Sergeant Alvarez didn't knock out ASEAL by waiting for permission. Neither will I. She got the spot. She graduated at the top of her class. And then there was the moment that Mina herself would later call the most important of all. 3 months after the fight, she received a phone call from her mother. Her mother had never approved of her military service. She had always seen it as a betrayal, a rejection of the life they had shared. But on that phone call, her mother's voice was different, softer, proud air, almost reverent. "I saw the video," her mother said. "One of the ladies at my church showed it to me on her phone. She said, 'Isn't that your daughter?' And I watched it, Mia. I watched you fight that man. And I cried." Mina gripped the phone tighter. "Mama, I'm sorry I didn't tell you no," her mother interrupted. "You listened to me. All those years, I told you to be small, to keep your head down, to not make trouble, because I was afraid. Afraid of what men would do to you if you stood up. But you showed me that being afraid is not the same as being weak. You showed me that my daughter is not a victim. My daughter is a warrior." There was a long pause, and then her mother whispered, "I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you." I was just as scared to say it. Mina sat on her bunk and wept. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had shed on the parade ground, but deep, heaving sobs that came from a place she had locked away years ago. She wept for the girl who had grown up hungry. She wept for the mother who had worked until her hands bled. She wept for every time she had been told no, not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. And when the tears finally stopped, she felt something she had never felt before: peace. The story of that day did not end with punishment or glory or revenge. It ended with something far rarer: redemption. The SEAL, humbled and broken, eventually left the military and started a small non-profit that helped veterans struggling with PTSD. He never spoke publicly about what had happened, but those close to him said he had changed, that the arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet kindness that surprised everyone who knew him. Mina, meanwhile, stayed in the Army. She was promoted to Staff Sergeant, then to Sergeant First Class. She became an instructor at a combat training center, where she taught young soldiers, male and female alike, that strength is not about how hard you hit, but about why you hit at all. And the 1,040 soldiers who had witnessed the fight, they never forgot. They told the story to new recruits. They told it to their children. They told it to anyone who would listen. Not as a story of violence, but as a story of courage, of standing up when it would have been easier to stay down, of a young woman who refused to let anyone, not a Navy SEAL, not the world, not even her own fears, tell her who she was allowed to be. Years later, at a reunion of the unit, someone asked Mina if she had any regrets. She thought about it for a long moment, then shook her head. "I regret that it had to happen," she said, "but I don't regret what happened. That man needed to learn that being a SEAL doesn't make you a good person. And I needed to learn that being underestimated doesn't make you weak. We both got what we needed that day." Someone else asked if she was afraid when the SEAL charged at her. Mina smiled a small, sad, knowing smile. "Of course I was afraid," she said. "Fear is not the enemy. Fear is just information. It tells you what matters. And in that moment, what mattered was not me. What mattered was every person watching who needed to see that the impossible was possible." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the 1,040 soldiers, now older, grayer, softer around the edges, began to applaud. They applauded not because Mina had won a fight. They applauded because she had won something much harder: the battle against the belief that some people are born to be victims and others are born to be victors. And somewhere, in a small apartment far away, an old woman who had once cleaned other people's houses for a living watched her daughter's interview on a tiny television. She wiped her eyes with a kitchen towel, smiled, and whispered to no one in particular, "That's my girl."